This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
Today on CityCast Madison. Calling all local TV news stations. Are y'all okay? Legacy TV news stations across Wisconsin are reporting layoffs for on-air talent and staff, and it's becoming a trend, which is not a good omen for local news coverage. To get a better grasp of this situation, we sat down with local and national media expert Michael Wagner. Wagner is a professor and director of graduate studies at UW-Madison School of Journalism and Mass Communication. It's Tuesday, March 4th. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Professor Wagner, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
You know, earlier this year, Allen Media, the company that purchased WKOW News, or Channel 27, in 2021, and also owns television stations in more than 20 markets, announced that they would be laying off meteorologists. The plan was that they would instead provide coverage from the studios of the Weather Channel, which Allen Media also owns. That plan was scrapped. There was serious pushback, but this is just the latest talk around layoffs in the TV news industry. Mike, can you tell us a bit about what happened there?
Well, I think Allen Media thought that they could save quite a bit of money by getting rid of a pretty expensive element of television news broadcasting at the local level, which is you have meteorologists and you need them for your morning show, your noon show, the evening shows, the late news at 10 o'clock. And so that's a lot of people. They have a lot of equipment and important kinds of programs that are expensive to license to keep track of the weather and manage it and be able to interpret what's happening in real time. So I think they thought we can save a lot of money by scrapping that at local stations and kind of outsourcing it to the Weather Channel. People who live in these markets that would have been affected, I think quite rightly flipped out, and Allen was responsive to the flipping out and decided to scrap their plans.
Yeah, I mean, folks love their meteorologists. It's thinking like Bob Lindmeyer. I think I drew a picture of him like decades ago as a little kid for a weather contest. And just weather in general, it's one of the most immediate impacts to your day-to-day. And I don't know what's more Midwestern than like knowing what's happening with the weather and talking about it.
So many people watch the local morning news for that bus stop forecast. Our kids have a parasocial mediated relationship with the meteorologists on our local news, and they want to know what they have to wear to the bus stop or to walk to school. And it's one of the things that builds the habit of paying attention to local news, is paying attention to those weather forecasts when you're younger. And so it was surprising to me to see Allen wanting to do this in the first place, but not surprising that they backed down once there was that strong viewer response.
Yeah, it was a moment. It was a shock. We do want to ask, is this cutting of local talent a part of a larger trend, or is this like very specific to Allen Media?
Oh, no, it fits into a large trend of trying to make cuts in local newspapers, local television stations, local radio stations. The general trend across the country is a reduction in staff that tell the critical stories of what's happening in our communities. And so this is just another example of the long-term project of trying to provide as few resources as possible to tell local news in a way that's still profitable.
As someone in media, I've never heard of it.
Totally news to you.
Yes, yeah. But that said, is local TV news and weather just like not as profitable in this day and age?
Local TV news is usually fairly profitable, especially in places like Wisconsin, where stations rake in the money during election seasons because our state is so competitive.
Over ads.
Exactly, through candidate advertising. And so we have a relatively healthy local media ecology in Wisconsin, especially compared to other states. But yeah, this effort has been going on, across the country for many years.
Mm-hmm. Well, we started talking about the sort of weather coverage. We have seen layoffs, as you alluded to, at WKOW recently. Last year, a handful of employees across the gamut were let go from stations in Eau Claire, Wausau, and La Crosse saw sizable layoffs at the end of last year. Can we hear from you about, what are the consequences of downsizing news teams and station staff?
The biggest downside is that the audience gets less of the critical information they need to make decisions about how to live in our state and in our communities. Local television stations are the most popular and the most trusted sources of news in the United States by leaps and bounds. It's really the only source that's broadly trusted by both strong Republicans and strong Democrats. And as they lose resources, as they lose the ability to have reporters do interesting and vital stories, we get more national coverage. We get more coverage from the Associated Press. We get more coverage about contentious national politics and less coverage about the kinds of things that are critical to living in a particular place, and less coverage about things that help bind communities together. Not all of political news is left versus right, Republicans versus Democrats. A lot of local political news is about snowplows and when are the parks going to be open and where are there going to be libraries. And these are all things that really matter to a community. And those things are not going to get covered by Fox News or the NBC Nightly News or other national sources that have no interest in weighing in on those really local kinds of events and issues.
Mm-hmm. Which is the kind of stuff we do on this podcast as well. We love talking about the snowplows.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Are you still quoting 30-year-old movies? Have you said cool beans in the past 90 days? Do you think Discover isn't widely accepted? If this sounds like you, you're stuck in the past. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back. Welcome to the now. It pays to Discover. Learn more at discover.com/credit card. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report.
You bring up so many good points, talking about what kind of content you will have access to, and particularly about your local community. I do want to ask, will these layoffs in other cities impact the content coming out of our local scene here in Madison? Will WKOW, who covers South Central Wisconsin, need to kind of make content for Wisconsin more broadly?
I think that that's coming. I think that local reporters are going to be asked to do more and more with less and less time for more markets, which is going to mean more superficial coverage, more easy stories to tell where there are people who are delighted to be on camera and are always available to be a source, as compared to the people that journalists have to spend time working to cultivate relationships with and coax into being a source for a deeper, more investigative story that has a bigger consequence for the community. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of what in the business we would call rip and read, basically just taking stories from the Associated Press or from one local station and then just farming it out to other places and having them all report the same thing, which takes away the local character of what the television stations are trying to provide their audiences.
Yeah, for sure. And I know just as a news consumer, go to a local site and then I'm reading a story. I'm like, oh, wait, this is from the national AP, something
Right.
that's just been put in that place. And when you have fewer staff, absolutely, there's folks being able to leave the computer screen and go out and meet people and find out what's happening on the ground and taking the time to develop sources and also get the verifiable information. That takes work and time. So, fewer staff, less quality, as you said. It's funny having this conversation, being that I've worked in media for my career, so everything is just ringing so true. I do want to hear from you. Are you concerned about what you've been seeing lately? Like, what's your worry level at for local news? And if so, like, what's most concerning to you?
I have a considerable amount of worry, but I also am really impressed with what local news is able to do given the constraints and the pressures that they're under. Like, so for example, like right now, one of the biggest stories in the country are all of the changes happening at the federal government level. And these stories can be really esoteric. They can be hard to understand. Like, why should a person living in Dane County, Wisconsin, care about the indirect cost rate for National Institute for Health grants and changing that result at the federal level? But local television, local newspapers, local radio, podcasts have all been doing a really good job of saying, here are workers in Madison working to cure Alzheimer's disease. Here are people trying to prevent children from smoking. Here are people trying to stop the spread of misinformation online. And their work is being stopped because of these things happening at the federal level. So I think local news is at its best when it's putting a big issue into the context with the people who live in a specific community. And I think it's doing that well. That said, I have huge concerns about the future of local news for all the things we've been talking about, plus the general decline of newspapers around the country. We have a couple of hundred counties now without a newspaper. We have 1,500 of our 3,000 plus counties with one newspaper in their county. A lot of those aren't dailies or in print, just online and not all the time. And as local television stations who, spoiler alert, get a lot of their content and a lot of their ideas from what's in the local paper, when the papers go away, local TV also has less resources to bring good storytelling because they're also hemorrhaging staff. And so the lines of defense we have to hold our government accountable and the opportunities we have to learn about who we want to vote for and why are diminishing rapidly. And it's not something that we should take lightly as people who care about what happens in our communities and in the country more broadly.
Mm-hmm. And it feels like it can create news deserts.
Yeah, we have, a couple hundred counties without even a local newspaper around the country right now. Almost all of these places still do have local television news that will broadcast. But what we've learned in empirical and transparent research about news deserts is that people aren't replacing the loss of local news with something else that's local. They're replacing it with national ideological news. They're replacing the loss of local news with Fox News and MSNBC. And this means more extremity in our voting behavior. This means we get along less well with people on the other side because we're not getting that kind of community-based binding coverage that so much of local media provides. And so there are lots of negative consequences to the loss of local news, not the least of which is that we trust each other less, which makes it way harder to compromise. It's way harder to compromise with folks you can't trust. And losing local media, I think, is kind of an overlooked linchpin in the whole set of things that fasten our republic together.
Yes. I'm glad that you mentioned the sort of national TV network shows. And, it's hard to not notice how overtly partisan they've become and sort of red meat, rage-filled spaces that are just hard to watch and listen to, frankly, to a degree.
Well, it's funny, like the research about these kinds of programs are that, one, people say they don't like them and people recognize they're bad for democracy and people actually do like watching them. And when we do physiological studies about like who's getting emotionally excited watching the news, it's people watching partisan talking heads yelling at each other that generates excitement. It's not, let me tell you about how NIH indirect costs affect Alzheimer's research. That's not the same thing that generates audience engagement. And so even though we know it's bad for us, and even though we know that it leads us to diminish in how much we trust the news itself and our fellow neighbors, we seek out this kind of thing that's bad for us. It's, eating too many cookies, even though we know we shouldn't, but for news.
Yeah, people getting those dopamine spikes from the rage content and rah-rah.
It's addictive.
You've maxed out your 401k, you're contributing to an IRA, and making some other investments. You're ahead of the game and doing well. But where do you go from here? The same old story can only get you so far. If you want a new take from a new type of financial professional, we invite you to get a fresh perspective beside an agent with the backing of New York Life. Insurance, investments, retirement, and more. Visit nyl.com to learn more. Investments are offered through registered representatives of NyLife Securities, LLC. Member FINRA SIPC, a New York Life company.
Oh, the sick day struggle is real. But with Dimetapp, it doesn't have to be. Children's Dimetapp works quickly to soothe multiple bothersome cough, cold, and allergy symptoms in a single dose. Our fast-acting formulas are designed with kids in mind, so they get everything they need and nothing they don't. Available in liquid and on-the-go chewable tablets. Tap the banner now to shop at Amazon and say goodbye to the sick day struggle with Dimetapp. Use as directed.
You know, I want to talk about how people are accessing their news. You know, personally, for me, I'm not a traditional TV news consumer, meaning I don't frequently turn on the TV to watch news, maybe after a football game, though I do go to WKOW, for example's website almost daily.
Sure.
Yeah, so I want to talk about sort of generational divides. A study from Pew Research found that just 46% of young adults reported getting the news from the TV, at least some of the time. That's compared to 86% for adults who are 65 or older. But young people are still plugged into the news. 91% report that they get their news, but they prefer digital sources. You know, what does this change in news consumption mean for local TV news desks?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The big change is generational, where people 40 and older are really watching that local television news and trusting it. As I mentioned before, you know, local TV news is number one in terms of our sources for information, and it's the most trusted source. This is less true for people 18 to 29 who are getting their news digitally, getting their news from news aggregators, you know, getting news from social media, really having a bunch of different entry points to learning about what's going on in the world. And so part of what happens is we lose a sense of community because we're not all consuming the same thing at the same time anymore, right? Now, communal consumption is around the Super Bowl or the Oscars or these, you know, one-time events that are never local. Whereas, you know, in the past, if you wanted the television on at your home at 5:30 in the Midwest, the news was on all three channels, right? And so you had to watch the news. People had a 33% chance of watching the same news as their neighbor, and so they could talk about things that they saw in a way that was really community building. And now that's more generational. I see some local TV stations and I see local newspapers and I see, you know, things like CityCast who are like saying, let's find modern ways to connect to younger news consumers. And so I've seen reporters who have active Instagram and TikTok accounts trying to find younger viewers where they live. And I've seen news organizations try to have robust websites with quicker video hits of things that are going on, to try and draw people in who don't have that 30 minutes to sit down and watch TV at an appointed time kind of behavior.
Yeah, the fast motion, the quick editing has really taken over. I'm embarrassed because it's like I'm seeing it happen and feeling it happen, but it is more quippy, like where attention is really shifting. But in terms of journalists trying to capture the attention of different audiences. You know, we've been talking about privately owned media, but before we let you go, we did want to talk about the federal funding impacts on PBS and NPR. You know, they've always had challenges with administrations that are not interested in supporting financially that work, but it's certainly a moment in time where there's a lot of worry about what happens to those institutions. Late last year, we saw Elon Musk tweet, quote, "Legacy media must die." Is public media just as vulnerable as some of the things that we're seeing happen with meteorologists and news desks? And yeah, I'm just thinking about them and what they're going to do to stay relevant and keep the lights on.
Yeah, I think public media is in a unique and dangerous position as well, and regarding like that tweet you mentioned from Elon Musk, legacy media informs the most people in the most accurate ways at a far greater rate than other kinds of sources, especially social media platforms, like the one that he runs. And so advocating for the death of legacy media is another way of saying, let's advocate for the death of the verifiable truth, which is, not what democracies need. In terms of public media, right now, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting gets in the neighborhood of $530 million from Congress. They provide grants to, local public radio and television stations, these don't end up being a terribly high percentage of the funding for these places, but they're important, right? And completely relying on the audience to fund you has been something that the private media world is showing is not sustainable, right? Newspapers are closing, television stations are cutting staff, radio stations are, hemorrhaging news staff and switching formats. And so that is a strong canary in the coal mine for what could happen to public radio and public television if this funding goes away. It's not the lion's share of where they get their resources, but it's still critically important.
Mm-hmm. And I know, just as a former NPR and NPR member station employee out in DC and then Chicago, I do see a lot of talk on LinkedIn, the career workforce social media platform, where because these outlets have been going through rounds and rounds of layoffs the past few years, like I've seen some of the outcomes of the financial pressures that these stations are facing. And I've been seeing calls online for public media to not get timid, don't get smaller. It's not time to play it safe. That actually it's time to get scrappy and bold. And it's also a tough ask for folks to take risks when you're simultaneously laying people off. What do you think?
I think it's always easy for others to say, you know what? You should be bold and I won't, right? I think that's an easy thing to say, and it's not bad advice, right? The more critical information news sources provide their audience, the more audiences come to trust those sources. And so telling the unvarnished, verifiable truth in a transparent way, trying to be fair but accurate is the best game in town. And to the extent that we lose that, we don't just lose the information that we need to make good decisions as a society. We comply in advance with people who should not be complied with in advance.
Well, it is a dynamic, changing market. I know you're a professor of journalism, and I imagine you have some undergraduates that are interested in joining these sorts of media institutions who maybe want to be TV news anchors. Are you hearing any sort of confusion? Like, what do we do? Like, what are you telling students at this time?
Even though local television news is suffering in some ways, in general, they're hiring pretty regularly. I think the big problem in local television news is persuading people to stay in that career for the length of a career. And I think what we see happening is lots of people coming out of college and getting a job and then maybe moving up a market after a couple of years and then deciding, the economics of this business aren't for me, or the hours aren't for me, or the constant attacks and threats on my life and integrity aren't for me. Maybe I'll be a spokesperson for the cable company or the gas company or the mayor's office instead and use my skills as an information gatherer in a way that, is more safe economically and more safe physically and emotionally. And so I don't know that the immediate problem isn't that there aren't jobs. The immediate problem is that we can't persuade good people to stay in the job.
Well, here's to trying, Professor Wagner.
That's right.
We so appreciate you taking the time today on such an important topic and your willingness to talk about the TV news. It's wonderful. Thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure being here. First time talker, long time listener and subscriber. So thanks for having me.
That's Mike Wagner, Director of Graduate Studies at UW-Madison School of Journalism and Mass Communication. He's also the director of UW's Center for Communication and Civic Renewal. That's all for today, here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, your host. If you enjoyed this show, why not share this episode with someone who watches local news? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care and support local.